This is Daddy Talk. Today, our special guest is Shawn Dove of Campaign for Black Male Achievement. Stay tuned. This is Daddy Talk around the world. Welcome to Daddy Talk. Today's guest is the president and founder of CBMA, Shawn Dove. My name is Kelvin Mann, president and founder of Good Fathers Only and Encourage Me I'm Young. Shawn, welcome.
Hey, Calvin. Thanks for having me share with you in Daddy Talk. Looking forward to the conversation and just want to lift up, who you all and all that you do, not just in Detroit, but across the nation and across the globe. And just being on this segment, I think it personifies one of CBMA's mission mantras that we have to become masters of our own media, right? And tell our own stories and not sit back and wait for somebody else to lift up our own stories. So I appreciate you for, epitomizing that mission mantra.
Well, I sometimes we don't have no choice. We just, purpose don't give you a choice. You just got to go, and I find my way, just going. My brother always tell me, that I have to be a certain person, to be a certain type of thing, to be an individual, to make a difference, so that I have to continue to go forward. Of course, that's one of my mentors is my young brother. But I like to ask you, how are you doing during this time and your family?
Okay, so thanks for asking. I think the first word that comes to mind and feeling is grateful and lots of gratitude and seeing so much and feeling so much loss and devastation and death due to the pandemic, right? And so, the Dove Nest is what I call the family. We are all blessed to be home and to be safe and sound. Ironically, my wife and I were having a conversation before the pandemic, and we were like, when this whole empty nest process gonna start happening? Can we get one of the four out, right? And the pandemic hit, and we were grateful everybody's home under the same roof. So that flipped. So good. As I said earlier, I woke up this morning, so that's a blessing, and the rest is icing on the cake.
Awesome. One of the main questions we ask to kick this off is, would you support a shared parenting bill?
And so on face value, shared parenting sounds like a yes, right?
Yeah.
I haven't done my research on what is under the bill, right?
Right.
If it's something that you are supporting, sounds like a yes. But I've learned, and I'm going to ask you to tell me, just briefly what it means. But on face value, it sounds like something that needs to be supported. And I have seen over the course of my life, in my own personal experiences, how challenging it is to only have one parent in a household. And my mom was an amazing single mom, Deanna, a strong Jamaican woman. And so I've also seen scenarios where dads have had to fight for custody and fight for visitation, and the power of having both parents, when both parents a positive input in the development and growth of a child. So I would say yes, but I would wait to hear. I don't know if you're going to tell me what the bill is, but
well, they're carving. The bill had went to the table, and so what is taking place right now is they're trying to figure out exactly how it could go forward without people being damaged. So domestic violence, those types of situations, want to make sure that their voice is at the table. Our mantra is kids need both parents, and it's significant that we preach. Well, I like to say I'm constantly preaching how important and value and how that value is attached to our children, our kids, community, the whole nine. Uh, my second question is, this is what the whole thing is about. Tell us your fatherhood story. I know you did some wonderful things around fatherhood. We talked about it before, but I'd like, the people to hear your fatherhood story.
Wow, let's see if I can, so I have a tendency to ramble, Calvin.
Yeah.
So feel free at any moment to, put up the time sign. And I think that I would begin my fatherhood story not uh, with me being a father, when I became a dad. My fatherhood story, I think, or certainly a part of it, is the fact that, I did not grow up with my dad, right? And my mom and biological father were never married and were never together, and never remember one day of waking up and saying a good morning, dad, right? Good morning, father, right? And I don't think I had a conscious daddy hunger, but as I continue to peel layers of just my life, I certainly see moments in my life where I was certainly missing that. But as I said earlier, my mom was a ingenious, creative, adaptable woman, and leveraged community capital, and ensured that I was surrounded by a nurturing community. And I had a really good relationship with my father's parents, my grandparents on my father's side. And I was just having this conversation with my wife, talk about the feeling of being unconditionally loved, right? And they just absolutely loved me, right? And there would be times that I had interactions when I visited them with my father, right? And so I didn't grow up with a blueprint of fatherhood. When you talk about, what is my fatherhood story? I had mentors, and I had coaches, and I had adult men in my life that believed in me before I believed in myself. But I think there's something different about everyday co-inhabitation and involvement, right? Because as you know, in the work that you do, many young people are growing up with amazing, powerful fatherhood experiences, and the dad is not actually in the house. And I was sort of a late bloomer with becoming a father, and I looked at all my friends who had gotten an early start, and you know how we do with each other, as a man, what's going on? You shooting blanks, and what's
Right.
that all about, right?
Right.
And I just learned that everything is in its divine timing, and quite frankly, I am 26 years into my second marriage, and in my first marriage, while we were trying and hoping, in retrospect, I'm glad that my personal fatherhood story did not start then, right? And so I am the father of four amazing children. Though, sometimes my prayer is, forgive them, Lord. They know not that they dance on my last nerve at this moment. I two girls first,
Right.
Nia and Maya. Nia is 24 and Maya is 22. And, quite frankly, secretly, I kind of like, with not having this blueprint and seeing how Black men and boys were treated in this society, and early on having, the two little girls and getting wrapped up and wrapped around with the daddy's little girl thing. And in my deep crevices of my mind, I was like, I'm good just being, the father of girls, right? And you know how God, girl dad, right?
Yeah, right.
But you know how God works, right? He has an amazing sense of humor and irony, right? And knowing my deeper thoughts, he's like, oh, you got some fear with raising a boys, all right? Boom, here's twin boys at the same time. Right? And, so while I grew up with siblings, part of my upbringing, I stayed with my godmother in Harlem who took care of other kids. I don't know if you remember the Hill Harper movie, Lackawanna Blues, but it was that kind of a experience. But for all intents and purposes, I was an only child, and particularly into early adolescence. And so my fatherhood experience had to, and my wife, who had four siblings, she was used to all of the activity. I'll tell you one thing, as part of my fatherhood story, Calvin, that I had a bunch of stories. As you know, our kids give us many lessons and much material.
Right.
But I remember a couple of things I want to bring up in the story. And one has to do when my twin boys were around 3 years old, maybe 4, and it was the middle of the night, thunderstorm, and one of my sons, Cameron, was calling out for his father in the middle of the thunderstorm. And at 3 o'clock in the morning, I'm like, why he calling for dad right now? He's not calling for mommy. God, I gotta get up out of bed,
Right.
because he's calling for me, right?
Right.
In all honesty, right, that was my initial thought. I wasn't like springing out of the bed, daddy to the rescue.
Right.
And went into his room and, hushed him to sleep, said a little prayer, and came back and laid down in bed. And I laid there and I had this thought, wow, what is that like to call for your father in the middle of the night and he comes running and he's there, right? It's just that thought hit me. And it was at that moment, the clarity of me kind of reconciling with myself. You may not have had that, Shawn, right? For whatever circumstances, right? And I got to know the story of my dad, right? And for whatever reasons why he wasn't there. But while you did not have that, you're going to break that cycle, right? And you are going to be there for your children, right? And begin that cycle. And so that's one part of the daddy's stories that sticks out, and being present, right, and not lamenting what I did not have or what I don't have, and cherishing what I do have as a father. And as you know, in doing these interviews and being a dad yourself, it is the most rewarding and glorious experience, and it is also, the most challenging and sometimes heartbreaking experience to be a parent and to be a father, right? There was one other story that I wanted to lift up just when I talk about my fatherhood story, because you may or may not know, I used to publish a newspaper called Proud Papa, for African American fathers, and launched that back in 2005, 2006. But the impetus of launching Proud Papa came to me one day, commuting to work on a Monday morning, and you may be able to relate to this. This was a weekend when, sometimes as parents and working parents and a working dad, on this particular weekend, I had one foot on the work week that previously passed, and the next foot was in the work week that was waiting for me. And it must have been a particularly stressful time because that's what I was dealing with, and I wasn't fully present like that weekend, right? And
Right.
I often say that fatherhood comes with a lots of thrills and spills, and I was literally all that weekend, not present. I was probably crying over spilt milk, and um, remember getting on the train Monday morning and feeling like, wow, this was a wasted a weekend. And my oldest daughter Nia and I, for a while, we had this ritual where we would write notes to each other and slip them and put them on the note in the lunchbox. And I remember being on the train, heading from New Jersey to New York City, and going into my briefcase to do this work that I was all consumed about on my way into the city. And there was a note in my briefcase from Nia, and she wrote how I was a great dad, and all of her friends, because I would do engagements at their school, and I was very present in the kids' school. And she said, my friends wish they had you as their dad, right? And I received this note at the right moment because I was not feeling like a very good dad. I felt like I
Right.
was stumbling through the dark. And on this Monday morning commute into the city, tears began to drop. And when you're commuting and you're in the same car and using the same seat, kind of like church, right? This is my seat, right? You see the same people, and I can just imagine my fellow commuters that are used to seeing me crying on a Monday morning going into work, thinking, wow, he needs another job, because he's crying into work. But
Right.
my tears were really about feeling so unprepared, and kind of, like I said, stumbling through the dark with this whole fatherhood mission and journey. And often our purpose and the path for our purpose as parents, as leaders, as husbands, are birthed and paved through our pain, right? And
Right.
that was a painful moment for me, but that was the moment I got to see to launch this publication called Proud Papa, and elevating stories of African American fathers, because so often, I would get together, with my boys, but we weren't talking about. Nobody was raising their hand and saying, I'm scared, I don't know what I was doing, right? Once we got past talking about the game or whatever, we didn't get that deep. And the publication really provided a platform for the voices of Black dads, and not necessarily the celebrity. We had some celebrities in the publication, but the everyday heroes, like the Calvin Mans of the world, to tell their story, right? And so the fatherhood story continues, right? My children are growing into are young adults and growing into adults, and my twins are 18. My twin boys are 18. Maya is 22, and Nia is 24. And as I recount my fatherhood story, there are days when I'm like, Shawn, Father of the Year, here's my award, right?
Right.
And
Right.
then there are days when, man, you're the worst dad. You don't know what you're
Yeah.
doing, right? And sometimes that all happens on the same day, right? In the morning, I'm like, yeah, super dad, and at night, right? And I'm thinking differently. So the beauty of the fatherhood story is like, look, today is, May 27th, 2020. I've never been a dad on this date, right? And I get another chance at it. And an important piece of my fatherhood story is, I think, emblematic of this conversation that we're having now, right? When I launched Proud Papa, I didn't even know that there was this fatherhood movement across of the country, and leaders like yourself advancing responsible fatherhood principles, policies, research, and I think that I came of age and came into fatherhood at a time in our people's history where we were beginning to shed, um, you know, toxic masculinity and gender norms, and that it was okay for me to go to another man and say that I'm scared, or go to another man and shed a tear and say that I need help. And that's really important as a part of my fatherhood story, because I've gotten so much support, and some with elders, some with peers, and even some
Right.
younger sharing their story. And let me tell you why this is important in my fatherhood story, because I eventually developed a relationship with my biological dad. But I remember distinctly having two conversations, separate conversations, with my biological dad and my father-in-law, my late father-in-law, before he passed away. And they were both telling me the stories of what they were feeling when they left their families, right? And so my biological dad eventually married, and he had uh, twins, a boy and a girl, Bernard and Tonya. And when he was telling me that story, he used the phrase, I felt like the walls were closing in on me, and I left. And eerily, I was having a separate conversation with my father-in-law, who was at the time, may rest in peace, dying of cancer, right? And he was telling me the story of when he left his family. And he used the same phrase of the walls closing in. And I was just so grateful to be able to say, because there are some days I feel like the walls are closing in. But they grew up in a generation where, therapy, no.
Right.
Black man and image and masculinity.
Right.
I can't ask for help. I gotta tough it and do this all
Right.
by myself. And so part of my fatherhood story, Calvin, is that grateful for a community of fathers and dads and men that are willing to get vulnerable and allow me to get vulnerable and say I need help, right? Especially those times when I feel like, tell me one dad that doesn't feel like the walls are closing in, right? And leaving is, in their generation, they felt like they didn't have any options,
Right.
right? And
Right.
I'm not justifying it, but so I think that's a part of the fatherhood story, us being able to even have this conversation that 30, 40 years ago was not being had as a
Right.
father and daddy talk.
Right. It was just impossible 40 years ago. I mean, we go back to, just a little bit. 1972 was the first time Father's Day was literally uh, locked in as an actual holiday.
You know what? I did not know that date. And 1970, there you go, 1972. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yep.
Right. So I follow it deeply. Right. And then I got another question, but I follow it deeply. So I followed it on how. Right. So I took it from the 65, the Food Stamp Act, to the 69 No Fault Divorce Act signed by Ronald Reagan, to the 1970 when it first kicked off. 60 some thousand people filed for divorce, right? and we became a divorced nation, right? And then you can't be in the house started being enforced and forced out to feed the prison complex. Well, in that process, during the 1965 peace was also the 1965 Juvenile Act, right, which put our boys in harm's way, right?
Mhm.
And we're kind of still in those same bills, believe it or not. But my next question to you is, having your story, how do you think having those two men finally reach and share that, how do you think that impacted your life?
So, in a number of ways. One, those were intimate conversations. And I knew that for both my dad and my father-in-law, that they exhibited some vulnerability with sharing that, right? And it took me back to the story that I shared with you at the beginning of this conversation, and going back to my bed in the middle of the night and wondering, like, what is it like to call your father in the middle of the night and he's there? And so it was affirming in ways. Sometimes we ignore our own or belittle or discredit our own resiliency and our own fortitude. And it allowed me to take a step back and say, well, you felt like that, Shawn. You felt like the walls were closing in various times in your life as a father and as a husband. But you are able to be resilient and work through and use tools. And I've always have had a given a spirit pouring into leaders, and I think it has also impacted me with being just even more intentional about pouring into young men and young dads. And I think what's really important is in that process, um, given equal time to not only like talking about the successes and theoretically this is what I am doing right, but you know what, this is where I've fallen short, right? And being vulnerable to share that, and because sometimes people will look at someone like myself and only see one side of the tapestry, right? And the front side of the tapestry is a mosaic of colors and designs and something you want to put up on the wall that looks good, and wow, I want that. But any tapestry, if you turn it on the other side, you got the threads and the colors, and it's really it's a mess, right? It's not the side that you put up on the wall and showcase. And I think that for me, it allows me to be willing to show the other side of the tapestry that I am, like the inner workings and what it took, and what's behind the scenes, so that the beauty on the other side shows forth. And so, those are the immediate things that I think of with the impact of those conversations, and particularly with my father-in-law, because that was one of the last conversations that I had with him before he passed away. And I've done some therapeutic work where I've had to forgive my dad, right? And I think that there are for me, it's not always just a declaration of forgiveness, right? There are different levels of a depth of that, right? And I think for my own biological father, that was another depth of forgiveness, right? If you understand somebody's story, right? And I'm not like condoning you leaving your family, right? It was like, and it wasn't like, he was telling the story, this is when I left you, Shawn. He's
Right,
talking
right.
about my half brother and my half a sister and their moms, and but it allowed me to, like, wow, if you knew better, you would, you could do better type of a scenario. Okay, I can empathize a little bit more, right? I may not necessarily agree with it, right? But it might have been the difference between him jumping out of a window and killing himself and staying alive, right? You never know.
Yeah, and that's the peak. That's why I toot this horn very loud about the value, right? Because we don't say how valuable, right? Your getting that information was valuable, right? And them being able to express that vulnerability is valuable, and us having the right to tell our story is valuable. So the young men who become fathers can lean on exactly some of this information that we share, right? And then it's a whole lane, which is another reason why I got into it, because it now allows us to not only collaborate but do some things to tell these stories. We have been left out, not just the black fathers are being left out, but the black father has really been left out. The stories, the very stories, like even the Will Smith movie. Another movie I had recommended and somebody thought I was crazy was Liar Liar, right? If you watch the Liar Liar movie and you watch uh, two of his movies, all included fatherhood, right? And how a father had to transition, right? And so that was somebody telling the story from a fatherhood perspective. And then when you get into our stories, how many of our stories include healthy fatherhood, participation, the whole nine? And we have these stories to tell, right? And I think it's our responsibility to tell it. The last question for you, sir, and I know I appreciate you sharing that, is what does fatherhood truly mean to you?
Hmm. So it's as I said earlier, the greatest gift that I have ever had, and the greatest responsibility that I've ever had in my life. And it is fortunately a continuously evolving a journey. I think that it is certainly, to me, means modeling love, right? And I can't talk about what fatherhood means to me without talking about the relationship that I have with my wife, and how my children, both my daughters and sons, observe how I love, respect, and honor my wife as a model. Uh, it means being a protector, right? It means being a provider for my children, and I would say my children and community as well, right? I think
Yes, sir.
my role as a father uh, extends beyond even the dove nest, right? As a father figure, right? And over my career, I've had folks, young people that are now adults, reach out to me, and I didn't know until years later that they saw me as a father figure. Um, it also means to me prayer, and uh, fatherhood will bring you to your knees and ask God for help, right, as a father, and then praying for your children, right? And I have uh, children going into adulthood, right? And there are different seasons of fatherhood, and my prayers have changed over the seasons. And I also I think that it means being a prophet, right? And speaking the future into existence for them. And sometimes, you know, you need
Yep.
a lot of times people to believe in you more than you believe in yourself, right? And so I think that the beauty of this, like what fatherhood means to me, that story um, is really told through the stories and the voices of my children, right? And how they answer that question. And when we get to that point, how their children answer that question, right? And so I think the full answer to what it means, right, is, you know, what do my grandchildren say and feel about themselves and about you know, grandpa, right? This whole
Right.
generational aspect, and I do think that uh, Black fathers in America have a unique and special burden, right? And you know, you talked about some policies that you know, part of like the last 50 years, right? But um, we were literally pulled out of our families, right? And in slavery and mass incarceration and overcoming that, right? And so, you know, fatherhood, I would say in closing, also means me being like compassionate with myself. That you know, I think that I have a tendency to want to be the perfect dad. And you know, Brene Brown has this book called The Gifts of Imperfection, right? And and a lot of it is, you know, dealing and growing with my own self-development and issues. But you know, one of the things she says in the book is like owning your story and loving yourself through the process is the bravest thing that you will ever do, right? And so I certainly think that being a present dad and a purposeful dad for me means, like, you know, being a brave dad, right? And showing up and uh, um, forgiving and asking for forgiveness, right? And you know, we're growing up in an area where we show a level of vulnerability and space, I think, for our children that a generation ago was like, you know, you're seen and not heard, right?
Right.
And so just loving the journey, man, and loving uh, and growing the peaks and the valleys.
So I'm going to read this to you. It's one of my fatherhood quotes. It's the day a child is born. The day a child is born, the first sound it hears is the heart of the father becoming a hero.
Mm,
Right? We part of where this drive comes from is part of my story was I was denied access to my dad. I had to fight for it. I took butt whoopings. And then as I grew older, it was men that was in my life and in my area that I got to see prosper in fatherhood. Excuse me. Then it was my uncles, my cousins, and
mhm,
uh, my family on both my parents' side, right? They're married 50 years, 40 years, based in the word and living it. Pastors. My grandfather was the first pastor on television, Alexander Miller, right?
mhm,
My dad, oh happy day, right? My brother's a pastor. Uh, you know, my uncles, big time pastors in the community,
mhm.
givers, right? And they weren't valued. We, for me, we have to create that value. We have to let the world know that we are that valuable, not just statistically, but it's in our hands to say, hey, we are very, very valuable, and things are starting to turn where it's fitting, it's cool, right? We kind of swag the fatherhood. That's part of what we do it. That's part of why I do it. It's because we needed to celebrate ourselves better
Yep.
and not be quiet and not be silent about it. So with that being said, I truly appreciate you. Uh, I'm looking
Can I
forward
say
to this month.
one more thing?
Yes, sir.
That as you were describing the value, it was just like on my heart to lift up the late brother Philip Jackson, um,
Yes.
out
Yes.
of Chicago, who
Yes.
seeded the Million Father
Father's March.
March, and which evolved to the dads, take your children to school day. And what he did with that was really exactly what you described, was like, we want to take a stand and elevate the value of fathers. And it was much more than taking your child to school
Yep.
every day. I mean, on the first day of school, it was getting engaged in school. It was being
Yep.
present around the school building. And I just wanted to lift him up. I don't know if you can hear that beep in the background, somebody cooking downstairs. And
That's okay.
that.
We're good, right? But it's funny because Philip Jackson is the reason why we started our fatherhood celebration walk back in 2009 when we heard about the Million Fathers March. We literally incorporated in our fatherhood march during Labor Day parade, and at
Yeah.
that point, it was very, very powerful and important. For it's always important that the father takes the kid to school, right? But then there's some studies. There's a book by Stephen Baskerville. I can't think of the title, but it's Stephen Baskerville, where they did research on when fathers took their children to school and the outcome, right? So what they noticed was that the children were not as emotional when the father, because the father would take the child to school, open up the door, trust the kid, allow the kid to walk out, and they weren't walking the kid in the school. When we walked the kids in the school, what they discovered was more and more the kid would give that emotion, right?
Mm-hmm.
So when the father would pull up, let him out the car, have a great day. The kid will walk in the classroom with assuredness, confidence, the whole nine. So it had, it is really a great book. It's his first book. Um, he's a friend on my Facebook around the fatherhood piece, and I love the fact uh, there are a lot of facts in his book that are very, very
Mm-hmm.
powerful about fatherhood. It's a good book to read. I just cannot think of the name right now, but when I get it, it literally, I'll let you know. I'll shoot you the name, but the text. But it's his first book. His name is
Yes.
Stephen Baskerville, and it kind of adds to what Philip was about, right?
Yep.
Because the getting involved with the whole nine. But when they're earlier and they're young, and you're showing confidence, the type of thing when you let your child out the car and let them go into school on their own, it instills a certain amount of assuredness in them, and it's just a powerful book um, to read. It gets into where we've been separated and dissected around fatherhood, but that adds to what Philip was about, and we kept the fatherhood celebration walk going. You participated, helped us out.
Right.
Yep. And we kept it going, and our men still take their kids to school the first day of school.
And you know what's important about that? And I think, again, you doing Daddy Talk and the work of Good Fathers Only, because the dominant narrative out there about Black men being absent, Black men being deadbeat dads, Black men, the criminalization of Black men. But there is research. I know Pew charitable trust did research. I think the Urban Institute did research as well, and it demonstrated that Black men more so than any other demographic, whether they were non-custodial dads or not, were more present in their children's lives, right? And so if we buy into the lies of,
Right.
the media,
Right.
we would believe, oh, fathers are not showing up, right? But
Right.
black fathers aren't showing up. But we are present, right? We're
Yeah.
present with our purpose. We're present with our power. And I think the other thing, and this will be the last thing I would say for now, unless you'll ask another question, is that also not just as the provider, right? Black dads as the nurturer, right? Black dads as, community builders. And, so we have to tell our stories,
Yes, sir.
and so that others, don't distort who we are
That's right.
as fathers.
That's right. So, Shawn Dove, I truly appreciate it, man. I love ever since we got connected to Campaign for Black Male Achievement. I truly appreciate it. I love the idea, about your book, your magazine rather. I really don't want you to ever not consider that again, because right now it's a big time thing. So maybe that's something. And
So you mentioned book. This just happens to be on my desk. We're a few months away from publishing I Too Am America, a book that I co-wrote with Nick Childs. And the tagline is on leading and loving Black men in America. So you are, I know you meant to say the Proud Papa newspaper, but
that's it.
That was in the past, and this is in the future.
That's right. That's right. We need more of that. We need more of that. I'm writing the parenting from brokenness and a fatherhood guide as well. So that's perfect. I appreciate your time. Thank you for being on Daddy Talk. This is Daddy Talk. I'm Calvin Mann, president and founder of Encourage Me I'm Young and Good Fathers Only. Peace.
And love.